You can let it go, take a step back, let the feeling flow, look around.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kalyce Carter. I am the accessibility coordinator here at Xenia Concerts. This is going to be our second interview. Our first interview was with Vanessa, and this is going to be our second interview in our Accessibility Accelerator Expert Interview Series. This is a title that is very, very much working. So it'll be something else by the time we're done this. But I'm very excited to have this conversation today. I'm very excited to geek out and engage in conversations about production and accessibility. But before that, I just want to remind you all and give you a bit more info about the Accessibility Accelerator, why these interviews have come to be a thing, and the wonderful Taylor. And I will absolutely have Taylor introduce himself. However, the Accessibility Accelerator got started in October 2023, but planning for it started April 2023. And through this at Xenia Concerts, we were really concerned with how can we build accessibility as a greater presence within the performing arts. We also quickly realized that we do not exclusively have the answers to that. Disability justice, which is a theme that'll come up often in the expert interviews. Disability justice really reminds us that it is those who are most impacted that should be given space to lead and to inform and to give feedback. So through that and with that knowledge, we came to arriving at the Accessibility Accelerator, where we at Xenia Concerts are very, very grateful to have 6 co-designers who work with us to be able to give us feedback on how we are understanding, how we're practicing, but also how we're growing accessibility specifically within the art spaces. So much amazing stuff has come out of this. It has challenged the way that so many of us think, and it has been a really, really beautiful way to reimagine what accessibility in the arts can potentially be. And while we're on the topic of reimagining accessibility in the arts, these expert interviews are really about how can we have these conversations, but also what is the work that people are doing around accessibility in the arts, and how do we get them to just like share with us about it? So as I segue into giving Taylor the floor, I would like to say that I'm very, very honored. We are all very, very lucky as a Xenia community to be able to share space with Taylor during this moment. I've gotten the massive pleasure and privilege to be able to work with Taylor as a co-designer on the Accessibility Accelerator. And I will let them share more about themselves so you can understand why it's been such a great process. Go ahead, Taylor.
Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Stocks. I use they and he pronouns. I also go by Dr. Androbox as a drag king, and I've been performing for more than a decade, starting in St. John's, Newfoundland, and now living in Ottawa for the past 4 years. I was really excited to join the Xenia project around accessibility in the arts, not only as a person, a trans person with a very severe chronic illness, but also as a producer myself, as someone who really cares about making accessible spaces where artists and audiences can work together to make sure that all bodies are welcome. And I also happen to be doing my PhD. It's in education, looking at queer and trans school policy and student activism, which may be slightly disconnected from this project, but also is informing me about sort of the next generation and what we can do within our institutions to make them more safe and accessible for folks of all identities.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Taylor. So as you mentioned, you are a producer, and within the sort of like sector of performing arts, producers fulfill a very specific role. However, I'm really interested in your specific understanding and approach to being a producer. I would love to hear more about your experience as a producer, but also as somebody who is a disabled and neurodivergent artist as well, and who is queer and trans. So that specific understanding is something that is quite niche. However, like we've mentioned, it really is important for those who are most impacted to be leading a lot of spaces Because more than anything, you can learn a lot. So yeah, I'd really like to learn more about your specific approach and experience within producing.
Absolutely. So I started off many years ago putting together queer variety shows in St. John's to try to give a bit of diversity to the nightlife that was happening at the time in early 2013, 2014, 2015. My first big project actually was producing an album of my own drag music with a band of 7 folks in St. John's, co-produced with the fantastic Natasha Blackwood. And that was my first real experience of putting together a major project while also being sick. I started the project before my diagnosis, and within a year I was hospitalized and put on heavy-duty steroids that really changed my body and my life in a way that I could never have predicted. So one of the first things I realized about producing as specifically a disabled person was the change in timelines that came up.
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to tell people now that I'm a dog with a bone, that I won't let it go, but it'll probably take me forever to get it done. So it took me 5 years from 2017, when I first started the album, to launching it in 2022 to actually produce the final project and to launch it in St. John's. And I think one of the first things we need to understand when you're producing projects as a disabled producer, or if you're working with disabled artists, our sense of time and timelines will probably be different than the ones that are expected. Even if you're looking at something like grants, which I used to fund a lot of my work and still do, those grants have very hard deadlines of when you need to submit and when you need to sort of report on what you delivered, and they expect you to follow the initial plan that you set out. The thing with chronic illness is that it often throws you curveballs, that you can have a fantastic plan that just goes sideways because something with your body or someone else's body happens. So understanding there needs to be a level of flexibility around production, and that things can still happen even if they're delayed, I think is a really important part of producing from a disability justice lens. One of the other projects that I'd really like to talk about is the first film project that I worked on, and it was here in Ottawa, which is a PSA about safe and accessible washrooms in the capital region and beyond. And this is where I held a focus group with a bunch of people who have problems using washrooms for whatever reason, myself included, as someone with inflammatory bowel disease who is also transgender and reads in the middle of the line often. Pulled all that information together, wrote a song about it, brought 16 drag artists into City Hall with a city councillor to perform this song. And I think that was probably the first instance where I was thinking about accessibility from start to finish.
I think both of us as performing artists in various different genres, and also both of us being chronically ill folks, we've come to sort of understand, unfortunately, that the expectations that a production can have is world apart from what we can offer based off of a specific amount of time. And unfortunately, within this system and within this sector, it creates these barriers that I don't think a lot of people realize are actually being created. So yeah, this is actually a great segue into one of my first questions. What is the responsibility of the producer to ensure accessibility? And then after that, I'd love to know some pre and post production considerations for some producers.
So I think that as a producer, you have some of the most power within the room and within a project. And if you're producing a project, you're producing a product and you're producing a process that goes along with that product. And anytime you have a process, you can or cannot have considerations about accessibility and how bodies and people and their humanity are going to be functioning within that process. The director can tell you where to be on set. The writer can give you particular script that may allow you some breadth and function. But at the end of the day, the overall organization, the labor distribution, the way that resources are divided lie generally with the producer. And therefore, accessibility concerns also depend on the producer and the decisions that they make within that space. As a producer, it can be really overwhelming just to meet the demands of the production itself, to find the right venue that you can actually afford, to figure out where the money is going to come from to pay people in the first place. So thinking about accessibility feels like this huge mountain that, oh my goodness, like where do I even start? Here are a few places to start. Consider the length of your work days and the type of labor that's expected and for how many hours it's expected. For me, I have learned that I have a pretty hard limit around 5 hours, and I do some of my best work around 2 to 3 hours. When I'm recording, my first 1 to 3 takes are usually better than my next 4 to 7 because I'm just tired by the end of that. And I think there's also probably something to be said about all bodies and how we prefer to work and how we produce our best work. I think being mindful of long work days, especially, and repeated days that don't allow time for rest and recovery is a really easy way to sort of dismiss anybody whose body does not do well in 10 to 12 hour stretches. I think this is particularly the case in the art sector, in theater productions where you have those super long days because that's all the time that you have access to in the venue. Another way in is our paid sick days. We understand, hopefully, following the intensity and still dealing with the ongoing remnants of COVID-19 and all of the other viruses and illnesses that go around, that we don't want to be spreading this, that paid sick days are really important. For me as an immune compromised person, I'm on steroids, which means me catching a cold, I'm out for 2 to 4 weeks afterwards. This is not a small cost that I pay for catching what seems to be an inconsequential virus for a lot of people. So within the Washroom Project, I made it very explicit that if you had the sniffles, or if you even were around someone in close proximity who was super duper ill, that I did not want you to show up to that shoot, and I will pay you for that shoot, and that's fine. And that's what ended up happening for one of our artists. And no one got sick at the actual shoot. And I'm very glad that they were able to stay home. And also that I had planned into the contingency budget and some flexibility around, okay, you know, this person isn't going to be there. When you have a bit of a larger cast, this is a bit easier to do. When you have a smaller cast, that's tougher. Again, just a bit of creativity around how you get those paid sick days. And then of course, access to like physical sort of safety supplies, I think expanding personal protective equipment out into what anybody might need. We had masks, we had sanitizer, we had tests, COVID tests on site as it was filmed just last year, and we still had access to COVID tests available. One of the other big pieces that I found really helpful as a producer was hiring accessibility staff.
I'd love for you to talk more about that, because so much of what you've shared, Taylor, is also speaking back directly to a topic that doesn't get talked about a lot, which is like, what are the potential access needs of producers themselves?
For me, hiring an accessibility coordinator was very helpful because I can do what I can to make sure that me and people who are like me are supported. But I know that even as a sick person who is knee deep in this stuff on a regular basis, I am going to have holes in my understanding and not be able to predict certain things. So hiring an accessibility coordinator not only allowed me to fill in those holes, but also kind of gave me permission to state what I needed in a more neutral space. So hiring the accessibility coordinator, and then as a producer, calling the production team together to have an accessibility meeting quite specifically before the shoot to say, okay, well, what are the pieces that we need? So that's where we identified, okay, transportation budget, especially like if you have any sort of mobility issues, having someone set up, you know, a paratransport option, or at least like being able to pay for their transport needs, having a budget for an ambulance just in case, you know, like you don't want your production to go in the red because you had to call an ambulance. You never want that to be a decision in the moment of whether or not you can afford to call an ambulance or whatever else it might be. And that's also where we identified sort of having hands, like right and left hands for the accessibility coordinator. So we ended up hiring just some accessibility hands whose sole job was to be connected to that coordinator the day of the shoot and to do whatever sort of physical maneuvering of the world needed to be done. So being
Okay.
able to divide up that labor meant that there was a team of people then who were paying attention to accessibility. And that me as a producer, I could count on someone paying attention to that sort of side of labor, just as I could count on my videographer for taking care of the film and my music director for taking care of the sound. I could count on my accessibility coordinator to take care of access within that space and within that shoot. So I think having those explicit conversations, having that team of people, making room in the budget, it wasn't a ton of money. I would pay their artist fee plus an extra percentage depending on what their role was. And that was agreed upon by everyone as fair pay and recognition for the fact that, yeah, I am doing extra work. I am using expertise that I have that isn't necessarily coming from my arts training.
Exactly.
But it's very possible.
From what I'm hearing from you is the work of accessibility on a production needs to be taken with as much urgency as like all of the other components that are required for it. But also the thing about accessibility is that it's a collective, ongoing, habitual effort. So like designating someone to take that on as well as providing them support so that they themselves don't get burnt out is like not just going to be beneficial to the production, but also it shifts the sort of culture and framework for how most people, especially folks who work in theater like you and I do, and have a history of that. Like we are so accustomed to being like, I have a 10-hour day ahead of me and let's try to make it happen. And it's like, no, actually, we don't need to try to make it happen because it ends up being not good for us. Like I wish I had a more like fancy way of saying it, but it just ends up not being good for us. And unfortunately, consistently, what ends up happening is that disabled folks, chronically ill folks, racialized, queer and trans folks on these productions end up getting burnt out because there isn't that consideration around accessibility and what that actually like means for us as well.
Absolutely.
Specifically, what are the parts of accessibility on productions about how we relate to each other and empathize with each other in order to ensure accessibility? And for me, at least, the reason why I'm asking this is because of our conversation around what are the needs of a producer, right? Like in that moment when you were describing having an accessibility coordinator and being able to know that like, oh, I could actually express what some of my accommodations will be on this project as well. It would be wonderful to hear you speak a bit more about like, there is a level of exchange and what are the parts of accessibility that are really about how we relate to each other?
Absolutely. And I think the collectively and the community part of it is the essential piece. I have been lucky to be able to view arts projects from a position of abundance. The fact that we get to make interesting art and come together, particularly as queer and trans artists, as disabled artists, is a joy and a proof that we have enough thriving parts that we can come together and thrive in that moment.
Exactly.
So I think acknowledging that you are actually bringing together a community to make an arts project in the first place is a way into that relational aspect of accessibility. And I think if you go looking for community in arts land, you find it all the time, right? Like you find it in all the moments that are not sort of explicitly like doing the art. Anytime that you're backstage with somebody, anytime that you like decide to share a ride to get somewhere, all of those sort of interstitial moments are those moments where we can open up the relationality and talk about accessibility. And food, I think, is one of the best ways of going about that. Anytime we share a meal, and sharing a meal is very particular for me as someone with a digestive disease, because it actually means so much to me when I'm able to eat with other people. And then speaking more as a producer with power in the room, I did sort of take advantage of my power in the washroom space at the beginning of the day by saying, you know what? Here are some of the things that I need. And one of them is like not something that you would expect. So one of the most obnoxious symptoms that I navigate is dry heaving, when my stomach feels a lot of energy, excitement, anxious, whatever. If I'm having a lot of feelings, I'll start to dry heave, and nothing's going to happen and nothing's going to come out, but it's like really awful to listen to. And it's like very uncomfortable to experience. But there's nothing anybody can do about it. And this was actually the first time that I flagged this to a group of people, saying, hey, if you notice this symptom, ignore it, ignore me. If you don't want to be listening to it, you like, please leave the room. That's fine. I can't move my body when I'm in that state, but if you are not comfortable listening to it, like, go on, do what you need in response to how my body is symptoming. And that, I think, was helpful on a few fronts. One is that, like, I had one of the best experiences ever with the symptom of people just leaving me alone, which was great. I think second was also showing that accessibility can look really odd, right?
It really gets me thinking about, like, for a lot of folks who are neurodivergent, and I think for myself as somebody who's autistic, so much of navigating this world is through modeling and through understanding how to engage with these things. And also this awareness that, like, being clear about what your access needs are is one thing. Communicating those things is something completely different. So there's something very specific about, like, the role that you took on and the space that you took up, and acknowledgement of your power as a producer to say, actually, I'm kind of going to model a lot of what we have here by stating what my needs are, but also giving guidance on how I need y'all to support me in that.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the questions of what your body needs and what your brain needs and what your heart needs are applicable to everybody. You know, even if you
100%.
are used to the 12-hour days, my guess is if you start asking different parts of your body how they feel about those 12-hour days, they probably have something to say.
Another question that I will have for you is, how can we queer performing art? And the reason why I'm using this sort of verbiage is primarily because there's a very specific way that queering spaces is what has been used for a lot of us to survive spaces, to be able to navigate them, to be able to work in solidarity with various people, all the while we're knowing this is a really hard space and institution to do this work within. Queering spaces is also an acknowledgement of, like, what is the material reality that we're in and what can we do with it now that we're here?
For sure. So queerness, queering, queers, all of these things are very near and dear to my heart. Drag, of course, for me is the performing art of queer and gender. And I, at the end of the day, hold out hope that the ways that we come together can perhaps protect and support us. And in some ways they do, and in other ways they don't. So when I'm looking at queering an organizational practice or queering an institutional routine, I'm looking at taking something that is for granted and saying, well, why not this way instead? So in some ways, that's kind of an easy turn of, like, oh yeah, well, paid sick days exist. Let's just bring them into the arts. And yeah, they're paid, they're not unpaid. So and it's just a small turn that is like, oh, well, yeah, that it kind of makes sense. It logically flows. You wouldn't even know that it was queered by the time we finished with it.
Exactly.
And then in other times, it's actually queering sort of foundational things and having difficult conversations about how we define something. So I'm thinking about queering success. What does organizational success look like? What does the success of an arts project look like? How are the ways that we are defining success impacting our bodies and our humanity? How can we queer success, turn the ways that we typically understand it on its head so that we have room? What if success in the arts was actually flourishing of humanity writ large.
Mhm.
What if success in the arts was livable pay for everybody who was involved in the project?
Mm.
What if success in the arts wasn't, necessarily how many bodies you get into the room and how many venues you book out? Important if you want financial sustainability of the project, of course.
Mhm.
But I think it's these moments where we can take something that we believe to be sort of certain and real and concrete and say, oh, no, 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 no. It doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to look like that. We don't actually have this. I think allows us to not totally tear down our institutions and organizations. I think there's kind of a reason we built them in the first place. If you look at like arts nonprofits, typically it was a bunch of people who cared really hard and felt that structure was a good way of keeping their vision into the future.
I guess the two other questions that I have for you, Taylor, are like, is there anything else about like the experience of production around accessibility that you'd like to share? And then my other question is about if you could elaborate a bit more about how we are defining success within the performing arts. Because what you mentioned about that was really intriguing, especially because it, for me at least, it sort of brings me back to like why I enjoyed the arts, because the process was so important to the entirety of what we were doing. And in fact, the success of the entire production, the many that I've been on, when I first started out, it was really about like, what is this process? What is this journey? What are we learning together? How are we sharing food and building community together? And I think also both of us being people who've been in these spaces for some time, witnessing the sort of shift in that is really hard. But also, like, I would love to hear more about moving away from or reimagining how we're defining success specifically.
Sure. So I'll start with that question and then close out with the other one. If you want to survive as an arts organization, as an arts producer, you have to have enough audience that you can pay for your people and your expenses. So it becomes, it can become a business like anything else, because you're just trying to make ends meet and you're trying to survive. And fair enough, survival of the organization is often a priority, especially if you want things to continue. There needs to be some level of success that is defined by financial stability, because those are the resources that you are mobilizing for accessibility and to pay your artists a living wage and all of the other sort of financial pieces from that. Acknowledging that as a continued reality for pretty much any arts organization, or almost any organization that exists, period, having expansive and queer definitions of success beyond that, I think, is essential. And for me, that my definition is probably similar to yours, which is more around the process. It's more around building community. It's on the feedback of bodies and hearts after a day. It's how able are my artists to work after they work for me? How likely are people going to want to work with me again because they feel supported? How likely are they to recommend me as a producer to other disabled or other marginalized artists because they trust that even if I don't quite know what I'm doing yet, like, I'm going to learn and I'm going to be trying my best? How long does it take me to get through the last 10% of the project? This is a new definition of success that I'm learning, because I often burn myself out at around the 85 to 90% mark, and I don't save resources to actually finish it. And that's where I really, really see the personal costs of engaging in a project in ways that I only realize after the fact aren't sustainable. Those to me matter often more. You know, I do care about quality. I want to produce a high quality art piece. And if an inch of quality is sacrificed so that I can make sure that we all are able to work the next day, like, okay, you know, that's okay. That seems like a fairly reasonable trade-off to me, right? Like if success is only defined by audience and like some
Absolutely.
generally arbitrary definitions of quality, then, you know, all of the humanity of the arts falls apart. And
100%.
especially in the arts, how can we not be keeping our attention to our humanity through the process?
Absolutely. Exactly. And like your point, like, how can we not keep attention to our humanity through this process? And like that is, I kind of want to like put that at the top of every like document that I like, planning document, and like we have to have another meet. It's just like, wait, hold on. Let's remember why we're doing this and what this is actually really all about. And to your point about the very easy decision of being like, yeah, I will sacrifice an inch of like artistic prestige in the name of making sure that people working on this production are leaving here whole, like leaving here well as they can be, you know? Yeah, thank you.
That piece of whole, the wholeness,
yeah,
right? Like we shouldn't
exactly.
have to carve ourselves into pieces to participate.
There it is. Like that's, and unfortunately, that is a newsflash most people have not gotten. And I'm one of the people. I'm just learning this, right?
I mean, and we're all learning.
Process. Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
We really are.
And some pieces, like sometimes we want to carve off pieces too. I think that's an important piece to acknowledge around accessibility, which is, you know, if I had the option to turn off my dry heaving, I would, right? Like I want to not have to deal with it. And sometimes accessibility is in not dealing with things. It's in me going to a place and pretending that things are fine because that's actually what makes me feel best in that space. So again, right, like access, it's so hard to pin down what it actually looks like, which is why these ongoing conversations about what the limitations actually are, right?
Yeah.
And limitations of the project as well. It's like, oh, well, we can't get into the venue except for these 2 days. Well, we have to meet this, you know, level of ticket sales by this date, which means we have to push it out by this date, right? Like, so I think the ongoing conversations then allow for not just, these are my limitations, I cannot work a 20-hour day. It's, these are the limitations of the product, of the process, of production.
There we go.
And that also is a vulnerable conversation for a producer to have with artists, because at times you do feel like all of the weight is on your shoulders, and if you don't make it work, everybody who's relying on you is gonna not gonna be supported.
Exactly.
So, you know, I think we are asking a level of vulnerability that's just like very difficult from a lot of people around this stuff. So the more that we can be kind and creative and compassionate about how we're putting things together and having some good solid structures in place that then make it so we aren't working uphill all the time. We're just at least working on like, you know, mild, gentle grade.
Exactly.
You know, that's, and I think, yeah, there's so much nuance that all you can give is kind of a, maybe aim this way.
Well, sincerely, and I think like, just as we close out, I think also something that accessibility does really beautifully, especially in spaces where it may not have been a priority at the beginning, is it really disrupts how we approach success, a goal, time, and what we're valuing in those moments as well, which is once again a very vulnerable conversation. Most of us are not, don't have a lot of experience with regards to engaging with when we're planning in production meetings as well, right? Thank you so much, Taylor. This was wonderful. I'm so excited. This was such a wonderful conversation. I was very excited to have it. And I'm also very excited to keep thinking about all of the wonderful stuff that came out of our time today. I know folks are going to be so so grateful for this, and also your delivery of it. For me, at least, as someone who's a producer as well, it was just like so deeply kind, while also being very practical. And I think for a lot of us as producers, we're like, thank you for that. I need the practicality. Great, gimme, gimme, gimme. So I'm very, very grateful, and I know a lot of other folks will be. Um, so that's going to wrap up our interview today, everybody. We are so grateful that you spent some time with us. This will be on YouTube and also a bunch of other platforms where you can absolutely listen to podcasts. Finally, please feel free to subscribe to us. We have a lot more stuff coming out. You can also take a look at some of our other videos in the previous interview that I did with Vanessa. Also, any jargon that you heard or any words that you heard or any concepts that you were really interested in, please feel free to leave a comment for us, and then I will definitely be following up with that. Take care of yourselves. Please feel free to like water yourself, feed yourself, do whatever you need to. And we will see you next time for expert interviews. Bye, everybody.
Stop, stop. You can let it go. Take a step back. Let the feeling flow. Look around. Feel the ground. Love will make its way around. You may not always.
A really special thank you to Jennery for our beautiful intro and outro song entitled Stop, You Can Let It Go. We're so grateful that we get to share her work with you. We'd also like to thank our funders for the Accessibility Accelerator, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Toronto Arts Council, and the Israeli Foundation for their generous support. To find out more about Xenia Concerts and what we do, hop on over to our website, follow us on Instagram using the handle Xenia Concerts, or you can look us up on Facebook.